There's a pretty well-known legal scholar up in Canada, and she's kind of surveyed the kind of household legal market in the United States and estimates that at any given point in time, there's roughly like 220 million unsolved household legal problems. When you hear that statistic and you go down to DC and like walk past the Supreme Court building and you see the inscriptions on the outside of it, equal justice for all, access to justice, like you really start to ask yourself if we have a disconnect, do we really have access to justice? So I would imagine that this technology creates the opportunity to deliver justice, to deliver better understanding, more access to the law than we have historically been able to provide at the household level.
Hello and welcome to the Madden AI Live podcast. I'm your host, Chris Madden, and today we have with us Jason Gabbard. Jason, how are you doing?
Doing well, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm great. It's burning the midnight oil over here in South Korea, and you are in New York.
I'm in New York City, and it's well into summer now, probably 80% humidity outside. So
it's gotten hot there, huh?
Yeah, not happy about that, but what can you do?
Nice. Well, tell us, Jason, what are you working on?
We are working on intelligent contract management, specifically in the commercial real estate industry. So, Chris, you probably know, but I have a pretty long background in contracts and AI. I've been doing it for over a decade now. This is my, Bowtie is my second venture in the space. And you've probably seen what's been going on with ChatGPT, OpenAI, et cetera. Obviously a great deal of fanfare in the market, but I'd say some of that fanfare is warranted, and large language models and generative AI have created a massive opportunity, really a big opening to solve a lot of problems that heretofore were not solvable. So yeah, we're super excited about Bowtie and the promise of marrying our core proprietary technology with large language models and everything we can do.
Okay, great. So commercial real estate and the contracts, the paperwork involved in commercial real estate. And if you've been doing it for 10 years, what was technology like when you were starting off in this field?
Good question. So back in 2013, people talked about machine learning, but it was still very much kind of traditional NLP.
NLP meaning?
Natural language processing. Calling it AI back then was a stretch. Very, very rudimentary techniques that oftentimes you could train an algorithm and find that you're better off just creating a set of rules, telling basically a set of if-then statements in terms of how to classify information or extract information. It's obviously the technology is much more sophisticated today, and out of the box with large language models, you can solve problems that frankly, at my last company, we would have worked on for maybe 9 to 12 months straight in order to solve. It's more than the technology that's changed. It's really the adoption and the readiness to hear the story, the readiness to test the technology, and the readiness to embrace kind of digital transformation at scale in these enterprises.
What is the story that you're telling the potential clients of yours? And the potential clients would be commercial real estate agents, commercial lawyers?
No, we actually started our first sort of live proof of concept was with a very large industrial landlord. You may know industrial nowadays means essentially distribution centers for the likes of Amazon. There is some traditional industrial, happening with the likes of Tesla and whatnot.
Oh, so the real estate that like Amazon owns, for example.
Yeah, these are big, the big boxes you see when you're on an interstate somewhere in the middle of America.
Mm-hmm.
But we went into a very large, this company was a subsidiary of a very large private equity fund. We said, tell us about a problem you have with documents. And the general counsel said, well, actually, I have what I think might be a layup for you. Our business is not that sophisticated. There are a couple of levers we can pull, and one of those levers is saving cost. Another lever may be, business velocity. And the general counsel went on to describe a problem wherein they spent somewhere between $15 and $20 million a year on leasing transaction costs. And if you look at the cycle, it's basically a sales cycle. You call it leasing, but these are your customers and it's a sales cycle. And so going from a letter of intent at the beginning to a first version of the lease was taking them about 3 days. They'll send that out to the tenants. The tenants are big, the likes of Tesla again. So they'll negotiate the lease. They'll come back with comments. Historically, every time a set of comments would come back, it would take the landlord 3 to 4 days, if not more, to respond to that. So, the manual process was creating real drag. The legal process was creating real drag on business velocity. And that's on top of, $15 to $20 million of expense. And so we went in there and said, all right, this looks like an opportunity that's sort of ripe for reinvention. And we built a system based on their historical data. So we basically aggregated a significant amount of their historical transaction data and created a system that can mimic human behavior in the leasing process. And so we started chipping away at those timelines. We've developed a tool which we call Prompt Track, which allows really, anyone in the organization, but in particular sales or leasing agents in this case, allows them to use natural language prompts or load contextual material, generate a first version of a full-length lease, oftentimes 80 pages in length. They can do that in a matter of seconds, and they can do it without legal intervention. And so took one bottleneck straight out of the process, true sales enablement. Beyond that, when the tenant comes back with comments, our system has ingested historical negotiations. And so it can make a prediction about how we should respond on a go-forward basis. So it'll actually look at a red line in the contract and rewrite it. And we give you reasoning for that. And in my mind, that's one of the unique value propositions, is that we tell you not only the what, but the why. There's true chain of thought reasoning behind everything our system does.
It's a contract negotiation. In negotiations, each side's trying to get the best deal for themselves. Is your customer the landlord or the leaser?
Right now, we work exclusively with landlords.
Okay, so is your AI trying to get the best deal for the landlord then?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the lawyer in me will come back and immediately say, well, what's the best deal? In some cases, the best deal might be the fastest deal. Like, let's just get it done. But it gets at the heart of what our agents are able to do. And so we can actually train an agent to negotiate. Tenant will come out. Let's just use a super simple example. Landlord effectively would like for the value to be $100. And so we can tell our system, get as close to 100, if not over it, as possible. And so the system may go out with an anchoring position of $175. And the tenant will see it and say, oh, this is ridiculous. 75 is the market. The tenant may come back at 60. And we can tell the system, negotiate, go back at 125, go back at 115. Alternatively, and we've seen this, again, using natural language prompts, the user can basically override and say, look, get the deal done. Let's move quickly. So let's make this a tenant-friendly deal, or let's just get it done quickly. And so with those instructions, the system, basically looks at historical precedent, says, all right, I'm just going to get us as close to normal as possible.
Can you tell the audience your legal background?
Yeah, sure. Not sexy at all, but I studied law at the University of Virginia, was recruited up to New York by a big sort of Wall Street Journal kind of law firm called Cravath, Swaine & Moore. I spent about 4.5 years there working on a variety of corporate transactions, so M&A, commercial real estate, private equity transactions, et cetera. Left there and went over to London and spent a couple of years in kind of a hybrid legal business role at Morgan Stanley. Again, primarily working with commercial real estate. So Morgan Stanley has a big real estate fund called Mesref. Mm-hmm. And I got to London, in peak kind of go-go times, like 2007. We were buying everything across Europe, everything that had a real estate component attached to it, we were buying and trading, and worked there for a couple of years and decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur. So came back to the States and started working on my career as an entrepreneur.
Did that realization happen at the crash, after the crash? 2008 crash?
Is that a subtle way of asking me if I was fired?
No.
No. So good question. I love Morgan Stanley. I think it's one of the finest institutions in the world. And I would have loved to stay, but I was on the floor at MS in London when Bear Stearns crashed. And
wow.
I was working on kind of a lateral move at the firm and had very good, solid relationships with some of my managers. And one of the guys called me out for coffee a few days later, and he's like, look, you've been watching the TV, you know what's going on. Your job is secure, but this lateral move that you've been angling for the past year, not going to happen. Mm. And I was like, well, when there's blood on the streets, there's opportunity. And so now might be the time for me to see if I can make it on my own. And I quit and took a few months off and eventually wound up starting a business within a year.
That's great. So that entrepreneurial flair now you've been riding high. Just going back a little bit earlier. So are you from Virginia? Were you born and raised there? Or?
No, born and raised in Kentucky.
In Kentucky, okay.
Yeah, I went to college in Kentucky. My dad was an entrepreneur. Back then we just called him small business owner. Throughout college, I worked for the family business and then decided I was ready to get out of Kentucky and was applying to law schools, quite a few law schools in the Northeast, actually. And I went down to see University of Virginia. I don't know if you've ever been, but Charlottesville is just a really lovely town. And I thought, well, this is probably my last go at kind of Southern living. I'm going to wind up in either California, Northern California, or most likely New York City. So why don't I give myself 3 more years in this kind of environment? And wound up having just a fantastic time at UVA. Great experience.
That's wonderful. When did AI get on your radar? You said that machine learning and you were doing it 10 years ago before it was called AI was the stretch. But what was that motivation to pivot into this space?
Yeah, it's funny. So I had an opportunity around 2010 to get involved as a minority co-founder in an information technology business, which was in partnership with a dear friend of mine, Mark Gerson, who's a very successful entrepreneur from Gerson Lerman Group. And Mark and I were working on a business called Matterhorn, which we really got the idea from Goldman Sachs. We were down at Goldman Sachs, and I think Mark was pitching them on some other business he had invested in. And they said, we're not really interested in that, but we do have a problem that we consider kind of tangential. And that problem is that, there's a ton of information on the SEC website, sec.gov, EDGAR, you've probably heard of. You can go there and download merger and acquisition contracts. You can download quarterly reports, so on and so forth. A lot of information there that you can download and read about companies. And there was really no great way to, in particular with public M&A, mergers and acquisitions, there was really no great way to search at a very detailed level and compare and contrast transactions. And ultimately what Goldman wanted to get at is what's market, what's everyone else doing? And when I was at a big law firm, this is the kind of call you would get at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, hey, head to the office. I need you to scour through the last 5 railroad deals and tell me what normal is. And so Mark and I and a couple others, we took some outside capital and decided to build a little business around this. And we wound up scraping 3,000 M&A transactions off the SEC website. And we would pay lawyers in secondary cities to read those contracts and copy and paste clauses into our database. And we wound up building a 700 field database where you could go in there and literally say, all right, show me every technology deal in the last 5 years where Kirkland and Ellis was involved. It was all cash, and we had an escrow amount in excess of 10% or whatever. Pick your adventure. And so we built that up. And as we were building it, it was very costly, because we were paying lawyers, in some cases, a couple $100 an hour to do this work. At some point, I said to myself, this is pretty rote. I know exactly where an indemnity lives in one of these deal documents, and they all kind of look the same. They change a little bit, and I know how they change. I'm sure we can teach a computer how to do this stuff. And so that was around 2013 when I started working on my first company as kind of a solo entrepreneur, with the thesis that we could automate that.
Wow. So cool that, you found this ultimately very valuable use case in saving a bunch of people a lot of time and be able to search all those SEC documents. Very cool. Bringing it back up to your new business, Bowtie. Is it Bowtie AI, right?
We haven't trademarked the AI and we don't have a .ai domain, but we may at some point use that.
So you can write up legal documents in a matter of seconds, minutes, where it would have taken days and be very costly to prepare in the past for these large industry commercial real estate contracts. As a lawyer, you've trained the model to do all this legalese speak. Do you still have a lawyer that reads through the whole thing?
Great question. So when we were getting started, I have a couple of partners. It was shortly after GPT was released. And we kind of looked at the industry reaction to the technology. On one hand, it was, holy smokes, this is incredible. It's going to kill a ton of jobs. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, it was, yeah, sure, we've been talking about AI for 40 years and it hasn't happened yet. And we kind of looked at the landscape and said, let's take a slightly different approach. This is something that has inspired me for 10 years now. There was a famous computer scientist in the 60s, J.C.R. Licklider, worked for the federal government, amongst other things. And he had this notion that the optimal outcome would be achieved through a partnership of amazing technology and good old-fashioned people smarts. And I think you listen to Daniel Kahneman, you probably remember the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I believe it was called. The idea is there's like this really fast kind of semantic recall of information that happens in our own minds as well as with computers. And then there's this slow think, like very logical, scenario modeling and stuff. And our thesis was really that it's through that partnership that you achieve the optimal balance of both. The computer is very, very good at thinking fast, and people are still very good at thinking slow. That sort of impacts everything we do at Bowtie. It drives engineering decisions, it drives UX decisions, drives go-to-market. And to answer your question, human is still in the loop, absolutely. Every time the human, our system isn't static, so it learns through self-play and kind of reinforcement learning, but it also learns through interaction with the human. And we encourage the human to stay in the loop, to make corrections that reweights the algorithm. Long-winded way of saying, yes, the human is still in the loop, and we encourage it.
You mentioned competitors there. I mean, the one that I know of is, what is it, Harvey AI? I think they're the biggest in the scene for like a legal ChatGPT. How do you differentiate yourselves from what they're doing?
It's tough to get a handle on what they're doing. They've raised a lot of money. I think they've been, for one reason or another, they have not shown a lot of what they have to the public.
That's true. I haven't seen much, yeah.
Yeah, if you go on YouTube, you really won't see much in the way of product demos or whatnot. I can't speak with a high degree as to how we stack up. I can tell you that we are completely uninterested in this concept of like a chat GPT for X, a co-pilot. I think that's massively saturated, and I struggle to believe that anyone will beat Microsoft at that game. But I was the idiot that once said, I struggle to believe that Uber can be more valuable than Hertz. So that's my personal take on the kind of co-pilot thing is not so interesting.
One of the big dogs is eventually going to be able to do it better because they have the resources and the compute than like a Harvey, law GPT.
It also creates pretty dicey data governance issues. So in order to get real value out of imagine a chat GPT for the deep web, for stuff behind the firewall, in order to get real value out of that, you need access to stuff. And so you want to give it a lot of information and connectivity to other systems of record, but you don't want to give it everything. And we see it just with pure contracts, and contracts is like the tip of the iceberg. A lot of companies just aren't prepared. They're not organized at that level where they can say, okay, here are the 7 silos out of 10 where I'm going to give this thing access. Because if you don't have that level of data governance, what you can wind up with is that you have some independent contractor in another country that has access to it and starts playing around, and lo and behold, it has access to your financials and your sensitive non-public information or something trade secret.
Right. Right.
So it's a bit of a thorny data governance problem that needs to be solved. I also, just taking a step back, I think one of the ways we may be different to a Harvey as well as some of its ilk. I was at GTC, NVIDIA's GTC. They're a partner of ours through a startup program they have. And I listened to Jensen's keynote, and he's like, the future is all about Gen AI, all about generation. The last 20 whatever years was about retrieval and kind of recall and finding stuff. And the next 20 plus years is going to be about generation. And, who am I to disagree with him? I agree in part. I think where I disagree and what kind of frames Bowtie relative to the competitors is that we believe generation is super interesting, but only if it's chained, if it's tethered to fact and reasoning. And in particular, in legal, in contracts, enterprise contracting, sure, it can generate new contracts for us. It can generate responses to negotiations. But we need to see that that's chained to historical precedent. And we need to understand, where the fence is. Because if you don't have that fence, that's when you run into hallucinations. And that's, at least, based on feedback from our customers, that's one area where we really stand apart from the competitors.
That's the same issue with like medical GPTs at this point too. There's a lot of startups that are trying to help doctors take all the notes for them instead of them having to do the notes themselves when they're talking with patients. But if the GPT gets one digit wrong or one like misspells or like says the wrong drug that they're allergic to, or just like one mistake that can mess up everything, and who's legally responsible, then the hallucinations are still like less than 1%, but how do you solve for that? That's still the big challenge there. And so it sounds like you guys are trying to take that data governance as part of your service offerings, or like, making it sure that it's safe and secure and that these contracts are going to be bulletproof.
Yeah, that's right. And again, like, we're not here to replace jobs. We don't think that's where the technology is. We don't think society is there. Like I said, we're really there to strike the optimal balance, find the right partnership between the human and the computer, in addition to having a very niche industry focus for now.
You mentioned that you're focusing on your niche of, commercial real estate contracts, but you're a lawyer and you're been in machine learning and AI space for 10 years. What do you think the biggest potential is for AI impacting the legal sphere now and in the future?
Yeah, great question. So not my arena per se, but there's a pretty well-known legal scholar up in Canada, and she's kind of surveyed the kind of household legal market in the United States and estimates that at any given point in time, there's roughly like 220 million unsolved household legal problems. When you hear that statistic and you go down to DC and like walk past the Supreme Court building and you see the inscriptions on the outside of it, equal justice for all, access to justice, like, you really start to ask yourself if we have a disconnect. Do we really have access to justice? So I would imagine that this technology creates the opportunity to deliver justice, to deliver better understanding, more access to the law than we have historically been able to provide at the household level. And I think that for society, that'd be a massively positive step forward. A few years ago, I was watching 60 Minutes and Jamie Dimon was on there, and he was talking about one of the lending programs that they had launched in Detroit. They wanted to really help entrepreneurs that had, up to that point in time, not had access to capital, not had access to a good partner. They wanted to help these people launch real companies, real businesses that would impact in a positive way Detroit. And he said, we thought the hard part was going to be the money. Turned out that wasn't the hard part. We got the money together and, we're ready to make a loan. And entrepreneur doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't know how to read the lease. Of course, knows how to read the lease, but doesn't, truly know how to interpret the lease. And so I think that kind of stuff, when you think about what something like large language models can do to law, to parsing the law and to making it available in a way that people without a legal education can understand it, super big opportunity and really just a big win for society.
What do you see as like the biggest problem in the law? Like, what is causing that disconnect currently between like what's written on the Supreme Court and then 220 million household legal cases that aren't being resolved?
So it's a couple of things. One is really consumer education. So a lot of consumers have a problem and they have the means to solve the problem, but they don't quite understand it's a problem. Estate planning is a great example of that. Anyone with a few $100 should have a will. But a lot of people don't, and they don't understand why they should. And this is crazy because I'm a lawyer, but I lost my mother years ago to cancer. She died at a pretty young age, and she didn't have a will. My father survived her, and ultimately it all worked out. But it created, at the worst possible time, created a lot of work for my father, a lot of work that he should not have been doing at that point in time. You're grieving and you want to get through that. You want to deal with your emotions. You don't want to deal with probate court. That's really an education. And again, shame on me for being the lawyer and not educating my own parents. So I think that's part of it. I think lawyers are expensive. I think by and large, most lawyers have pretty bad kind of bedside manners and they seem unapproachable. And frankly, most consumers would probably rather not talk to a lawyer. So maybe we as a profession could kind of recast our image and make ourselves a little bit more accessible and friendly.
I would think like, okay, I've got a legal question to talk with a lawyer. It's going to cost me like $600 an hour or something. And based by like 5-minute intervals already people are using ChatGPT to like ask legal questions, right? And get this kind of better framework, at least, even though ChatGPT prefaces it by like saying that you should talk to a lawyer, but really it gives you like the different sides of it. I'm sure it's already making things more accessible and potentially taking time away from lawyers' hours that they bill.
You're absolutely right. Like if you look at immigration, for example, hot issue right now, the immigration law is insanely complicated. The tax law is insanely complicated. Like to the extent we have a tool that can digest that and make information and insights available to people at little to no cost. Yeah, of course, you have to be dangerous, or you have to be concerned about the dangers of hallucination. And same with medicine, right? Like the second you go online and start searching whatever ailment you have, like you're in trouble. You get these articles and you're like, oh my God, I'm dying. It turns out you just have a strained muscle, right? You do have to balance against giving people too much information that they may synthesize the wrong way or overreact or whatever. But definitely, and to your point about already eating into lawyers' time, yeah, I have friends that have called me up recently and said, hey, do you know anyone that can do XYZ? You know, I have a set of documents I produced on ChatGPT and they look pretty good. I just want someone to take a quick look and make sure everything's, kosher. That's definitely already happening. We actually, one of our early supporters and investors is the managing partner at a big well-known law firm, which you certainly would know. And when he saw our product for the first time, he said, this is finally going to kill the billable hour. And I think he's probably right. Not kill it. The billable hour will still exist if you're a very high profile executive facing some kind of criminal charge and you want to get, someone that's been practicing criminal law for 40 years to really work through all the scenarios with you. That the billable hour will still exist there, but for more routine work, you can definitely see an end in sight.
Right. And all the discovery, the document, like filtering through all the documents. Can you go on about how AI can save lawyers and legal firms time?
Yeah, I mean, coming full circle, yeah, for sure. When I started my first company I mentioned in 2013, that was one of the use cases. And I used to do this, you're doing some M&A transaction and you really want the lawyers to put their eyes on everything that's close to material in terms of a contract, because you're buying a business, right? And a big part of the business is its contracts. You want to read through those contracts. There are obvious issues and then there are more nuanced issues, but obvious issues like a prohibition on assignment or a right to terminate if there's a change in control. And those are things that when I started practicing law, they would bring a big, not one box, they would bring 6, 10 boxes, banker boxes into your office. And you spend the next week just reading these contracts, flagging issues. And today that is the lowest hanging fruit possible.
So boxes of documents used to be brought in that lawyers would have to read themselves and filter through all the information and pull out the valuable stuff, the problems and whatnot. 10 boxes. How is that done today?
There are these companies, Relativity is one you may have heard of, these e-discovery companies. And that's really what they focus on. A lot of them were built around litigation use cases in court, but that's what they can do. They can thread emails. They do topic modeling inside of emails so you understand what this email at bottom talks about and how it relates to the others, and run over data rooms and spot issues like this, change of control issues, assignment issues, and more. They have access to the same technology we have access to. So it has definitely gotten a lot more powerful in the last 4 or 5 years, but that's their core use case.
Awesome. How can AI reduce the backlog that so many of these courthouses have in case reviews and getting through cases?
I'm so happy you asked that, because you jogged my memory earlier when you asked me how AI would fundamentally impact the law. That's another sort of exacerbates the household legal problem of the 200 million problems that when you do figure out you have an issue and you get into the courts, it's could be a year and a half before you see a judge. And this is something I looked at before I started Bowtie. I was trying to wrap my head around whether there's a better solution to dispute resolution. We have small claims courts. They were meant to take some of the burden off the Supreme Court, for example, in New York. The small claims court, the civil court, they're meant to take some of the smaller cases and take that burden off the judges. But it's not a very effective system. And the last time I looked at this problem, I think the most active sort of dispute resolution tribunal in the world was eBay. eBay, for a long time, they've had this like little, basically small claims dispute resolution portal where, you can disagree with the buyer or seller about something and they'll resolve it for you. And I think there's a lot we can learn from some of these online platforms that give you the ability to adjudicate disputes. So that's one way. I think you could imagine in a not so distant future that parties will just agree to let some AI adjudicate a small dispute. Maybe if it's New York City is a great test case in my mind, like residential leasing, right? There's so many residential leases in New York. Most of those, 99% of the disputes between a landlord and a residential tenant shouldn't go to court. Like, I could imagine a world where we just submit a low-level dispute like that to AI and take our chances.
Yeah, very interesting. I imagine the bureaucracy, the paperwork involved in these courthouses too, operationally, that's what AI is helping to solve for a lot of businesses and entities is streamlining of this information. And I'm sure you need somebody to come in and take a holistic approach to something like a courthouse to improve the systems so that they can process information and get through these cases quicker.
Yes, for sure. I think another interesting question is like where it's going to happen. Delaware has always been a fairly innovative court system. Like, we need a first mover. We need someone to embrace it, go first.
I was going to ask that if there's anybody that's made moves to streamlining this process and embracing AI.
Not that I'm aware of. As far as I know, like the latest innovation in New York State is online filing. We haven't, which is crazy. I'm not aware of anything, but there are so many opportunities. Search, marry a great search algorithm with a large language model and turn it loose on court records.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah. I
don't know why that hasn't been done.
Should be done.
I know there are some private players that scrape court data and they've aggregated data across multiple jurisdictions. I got to think that some of the private entities are thinking about this, if not already doing some of it. But the courts themselves should really do it. We spend a lot of money with court systems and they're kind of their own worst enemy.
Yeah. It takes some maybe some voter education to make it like a campaign issue or something. Like, I'd love to hear a politician say that he's going to streamline all of these slow, aching bureaucracies with some new tech and AI and software. It'd be incredible. I'd totally vote for that person. So I heard a case of like a lawyer using ChatGPT in the courtroom and getting busted. Did that happen?
It's funny you mention that because early on in the life of ChatGPT, I personally received some kind of like demand letter related to maybe like an apartment building I own in Kentucky. And I was lazy, so I put it in there and I was just like, just respond to this and please cite, relevant case law. And I got the thing back and I was like, holy smokes, this is incredible. Had the case cites in there and this case stands for the proposition that, I'm like, oh my God, like the legal profession is over. And I was about to send that letter out. It's like, let me have a look at one of those cases just to make sure. And I went online and I got into one of the case, the Lexis or whatever to search for the case. Did not exist. Entirely made up. So I could have been that guy. Fortunately, in that case, it would have gone to a civil counterparty and not to a court system. But, Chris, that goes back to my point earlier. Generation is great, but if it's not tethered to reality and if it's not tethered to fact and reasoning, you got to be careful.
Well, Jason, tell us again about Bowtie and kind of your excitement around it.
Definitely. So as it exists today, it's an end-to-end AI-powered leasing platform for commercial real estate owners. Having sold my last company to a big contract lifecycle management business and having spent considerable amount of time with the Global 2000 talking about enterprise contracting and the problems associated with contract management, the bottlenecks it creates, the inefficiencies. My view is that after we conquer commercial real estate, we have an incredible opportunity ahead of us to go out and really upend everything that's happened in contract management in the last 10 years. I think most of the existing approaches are flawed. They start with a sort of input first model. Bowtie is an intelligence first model. It's grounded, everything we do is grounded in historic fact, in sound reasoning. And so for me, that's what I'm most excited about. I'm most excited about continuing to deliver value for the customers we have today in this industry but I've studied pretty deeply how DocuSign went to market and how first they had success in real estate and then they moved out from there. I think we can do something very similar. We will continue to focus on commercial real estate, but over the next 6 to 12 months, we will selectively start to pursue opportunities outside of real estate. And eventually, I do believe we have an opportunity to really upend all of contract management.
Wow. Well, very inspiring to hear. I wish you the best of luck in this long journey, as I know starting a business is. And it was a really fascinating conversation.
Chris, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I've enjoyed speaking with you. I will take all the luck you can send my way because that's probably one of the top 3 most important things an entrepreneur can have. So
you need luck on your side for sure.
Keep it coming.